Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's LinkedIn Live. I'm Laura Putnam, and I have an amazing guest today, Israel, aka Is Greene. We're so excited to have you, and we're going to be talking about the topic of DEI meets wellness. And I'm speaking to you all right now from Bend, Oregon. It may look like that this is a cooking show. This is my sister's my sister and brother-in-law's amazing kitchen here. So I'm really excited to have this background here. And where are you coming from?
I am actually based out of Chicago.
All
So right
right.
downtown. Yeah.
And you've got lots of smoke right now, unfortunately, with the fires up in Canada. So hopefully you're
We
staying
do.
safe.
Absolutely. We do.
Yeah. So if I could get all of our guests to enter into the comments where you're coming from, feel free to let us know. And so without further ado, let me introduce you to he is the founder and owner of Greene Consulting Group, which is a boutique consulting firm that leverages their proprietary strategy framework to ensure companies are implementing global best practices and are fully equipped to handle the ever-changing landscape around DEI strategy. So in other words, you all really implement strategies around DEI that actually work. In simple,
Yes.
everyday
Yes.
language. And you're also an award-winning international keynote speaker and also a good friend. And so I'm delighted to have you on the show and really excited about having you speak to this topic of DEI meets wellness.
Well, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you. And I think I might take that little snippet that you just said, strategies that actually work, and throw that on my website.
You're welcome to, to use it. So it looks like that we've got Dr. Anand S. Coming in, and he asked what I'm cooking. Nothing right now, cooking a good conversation, hopefully. We've got Marissa coming in from Montana. We've got Denise also coming in from Chicago. So welcome, everyone. Really
Hey,
excited
Denise.
to have you. And as is always the case, please enter your questions and comments as we go along. And is fully prepared to answer prepared questions, but also questions and comments that come in. So I would love to just start with talking a little bit about your story and how you got involved with this. And also at the same time, if you can give us a little bit of a background around your nickname is.
Yeah. So is just short for Israel. I hate Izzy. So is kind of what has transpired. And it's interesting because when I'm on stage or I'm in front of an audience or even at a boardroom table, I always tell them, you know what, my name is Israel. Feel free to call me Is. And what I've noticed by doing that is it really does put the human element back into the room, which I think is really important with the work that we're doing. And it just says that I'm not just some Mr. Greene or something like that, but it really just makes it more personal. And that's that touch that makes us unique versus a lot of other DEI strategy companies or leadership development companies. With regards to my story, I have been pretty blessed in that I've been able to move around quite a bit. And as a result of that, it's opened up quite a few opportunities for me. And what I noticed is, even though I was getting the opportunities presented to me, I wasn't necessarily getting the financial reward that typically accompanies those opportunities, nor was I getting those stretch assignments unless it benefited the company. And I would look around, and other individuals that look like me, even women, weren't getting the same thing either. So I thought, okay, how can I remedy this? And what I noticed is that I felt, and I really kind of put together this, what I would describe as a philosophy, that no leader should feel like the work that they're doing doesn't have an impact on the organization, nor should any employee feel like they go into a job every single day and feel like they can't fully show up unless it's at the benefit of someone else that's at the table. So essentially, I'm like, how can I change this? And I ended up putting together a leadership development program initially. And from there, I continued to develop and continue to evolve. And as a result of that, I ended up getting a lot more credentials to make sure that no one could say to me, hey, you know what, you don't belong here because you don't have this, or we're not giving you this opportunity because of X. And as a result of that, Greene Consulting Group was formed. And now I'm able to help others have a seat at the table and hopefully create a level of equity that they haven't really identified before.
I think it's so interesting because you're in the DEI space, I'm in the wellness space. A lot of the people who are on the call today are also in the wellness space. And traditionally, DEI and wellness have been siloed, kind of two separate
Yeah.
of entities. But really, so much of what you're talking about, things like bringing in the human element, things like feeling like you matter, things like you feel like you belong, that you can show up as your full authentic self, those are all things that tie to well-being, and I would say well-being in a really true sense, not just the superficial wellness in terms of I take a health risk assessment, for example, but really feeling like I get to come to work and be my best self. So why don't we jump right into just tell me a little bit about your thoughts around what you see as the intersection between DEI and wellness.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's really about the mental aspect of things. That emotional piece I think is extremely important, and that shows up and impacts us in different ways. There's intersection in how we talk about each of these topics as well. And I mental health is really coming to the light where we're trying to talk about things more. But there's still a stigma associated with it. So it's like, hey, you know what? Don't say that. Or you can't bring that to work. You keep that at home, keep that outside of here. But that's part of who we are. It's part of how we show up, how we process. So there's diversity even in healthcare. And ultimately, there's the intersectionality between how we show up, what impacts us, and how we show up. So you think about things like when we watch things on TV, and we see these representations of us, it impacts our mental health and our emotional health and that psychological piece of us, so that we're showing up physically, but it's only a portion of that. And it's called presenteeism, essentially. It's showing up but not being able to fully perform at your highest level. And that impacts work. So I think there's intersectionality in how we approach it, what we talk about, and the emotional impact of diversity related topics.
Interestingly enough, presenteeism is actually the biggest cost related to poor health and well-being in the workplace. And to your point, when we talk about well-being, it's not just physical, but it also encompasses multiple dimensions, including emotional, it includes social, it includes community, it includes financial, career, all these things, which arguably are totally intertwined with
Mhm.
issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. So again, I encourage people who are listening in, please pose your questions or your thoughts as we go through this. And again, is prepared for that. So Dr. Anand has asked, what examples of taboo mental health topics have you come across?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is diversity in how we process and do our work. And that goes back to mental health. So someone that may have ADHD or ADD or whatever it might be, they can't bring that up. However, it impacts how they show up and how much work they're able to get done in a period of time. So to show up and tell someone and think that they are going to hire you, or not be able to say, hey, I've got this, how do you accommodate for that? And we typically aren't equipped as leaders to acknowledge that and say, well, you know what we could do is this. And instead of having you do 8 hours straight, maybe we do blocks of time. So that's kind of the way that we need to be approaching this thing. Just really understanding that there is diversity in terms of how we think, how we show up, and making sure that we equip the leadership to talk about those things, such as the mental health aspect of, okay, what can we do to help, and not have people fearful of saying, I wrestle with or I'm living with this.
It's really interesting. You're talking about diversity, and often we think about it primarily in terms of race and gender, but there are also diversity shows up in terms of things like neurodiversity, as you're
Yeah.
speaking about right now, but so many other dimensions, financial, geographic. What are some other aspects? When you really define what diversity means, how would you define that as?
Wow, that's for me, it's anything that makes a person unique, that they're bringing to the table that we're able to leverage. So everything from thought, everything from experience, everything from viewpoint. It could be, that you're married. It could be that you have children. It could be that you're a mother. It could be that you're from the LGBTQ community. It could be that you're a minority from a culture, a different culture, age, all of the things that make us unique that we can bring to the table, so that when you sit around the table and you say, what's one thing that makes you unique? And someone mentions something, and you think about who you're serving, who are you, selling to, who's your service offerings focused on. Whenever we're able to identify those things and tap into those unique perspectives, that's really where we're able to thrive and grow the most. But it's everything that makes us unique is the easiest way to look at it.
And I think, one of the ways to look at this maybe is shifting from a mindset of assimilation to really celebration of diversity, and understanding that when we bring in all of these forms of diversity, and by the way, we've got a big month of this month with Juneteenth as well as Pride Month, that actually it benefits not only the people, but also it benefits the bottom line, something that you were talking about earlier around really having to wake up leaders around that conversation. So let's kind of I'd love to talk a little bit before we talk about how do we really address this in the workplace. But can we talk briefly about the landscape that we are navigating right now in terms of laws that are being passed in states like Florida around teaching critical race theory in schools, to the Supreme Court cases that are up, that the decision is going to be handed down either tomorrow or Friday around affirmative action. Both Harvard University and University of North Carolina, their affirmative action policies are being put to question, and potentially the longstanding Bakke case, the precedence is maybe, if not likely, to be turned over. So let's just talk about kind of where we've been, particularly post George Floyd, and kind of this ebb and flow where there's this awakening around the need to really speak to DEI and bring it to every workplace, but then also the backlash that's happening.
Yeah, I guess in a few words for me, I would say confusion, frustration, and opportunity, I think is really what it boils down to. And fatigue, I guess, is that fourth word, because everyone is like, why do we keep talking about this? Why does this keep showing up? And the answer is because it keeps happening, and until it stops, it's we can't move forward. So those four things: confusion, frustration, opportunity, and just fatigue are huge. But I think we have to start acknowledging the tough conversations that are taking place, and acknowledging the wrongs that are there, and stop, for lack of a better word, whitewashing much of what is taking place in the history that's happened. A good example, I read a quote yesterday and I have it pulled up here. It's a quote from SVP at Liberty University, and he says basically it's an evangelistic movement on the left, and that's what's happening. It's indoctrination. I mean, they're proselytizing to the next generation, and what we're discovering as parents and conservatives is, wait a second, education really is evangelism. So if you don't control education, you cannot control the future. And Stalin knew that, Mao knew that, and Hitler knew that. So we have to get back for conservative values. This statement alone is so alarming. And the fact that this is at a Christian university, that people are buying into this narrative. So it's scary, but we have an opportunity to be able to speak up and be the voice for those that can't be heard, and scream louder than we've ever screamed before. That's the landscape that we're on now.
Yeah, I love the way you frame this up as confusion, frustration, fatigue, but also opportunity. And so let's dive a little bit into, and I also want to just acknowledge, how many of these issues are so deep seated, they're institutionalized. I mean, let's not forget that in our Constitution, African Americans are counted as 3/5 of a person. I mean, that it is so embedded in our history, and in our institutions. It's no wonder why
Yeah.
we have such a long road to go. And as much as people may get tired of that conversation, we have to continue to stay the course. So let's talk a little bit about the opportunity that we have in leveraging every workplace, leveraging every team to really start to make a difference. And in this is, I would love it if you would kind of help us to understand how much of this is in kind of fixing the issue at hand is really about what individuals need to be doing differently versus what organizations need to be thinking about doing on a more systemic level, and then perhaps even what we could be doing team by team.
Yeah. I love that you're breaking it down this way. Very first thing, I think that we need to be looking at each individual in our organization as a leader and understanding that each person has the ability to influence someone else. So kind of backing up for a moment from an organizational perspective, I think it's about taking the time to understand your employee demographic and understand specifically the underrepresented groups, meaning what are those challenges, the challenges that are there that they're faced with. A couple of examples of how this might show up is understanding that members of the LGBTQ community, a study just came out this week that says they are 2.5 times more likely to express depression and anxiety than those that are not a part of that community. And because of the discrimination that they face, they oftentimes will not go get help and they avoid it altogether. Similar with BIPOC. So seeking out mental health care, we're looking for providers that are culturally competent that we can identify with. So an organization can put systems in place that says, hey, we know these providers are culturally competent. They've made statements. Here's a list of providers that you might want to consider. We make them easy and accessible. That's one thing that organizations can do as a whole. Understanding the challenges and providing resources to culturally competent care is huge. And for the love of all things holy, please, if you are a head of an organization, please stop piecemealing these programs together. They do not create sustainable solutions. So we need to make sure that we are putting in strong pillars and a strong foundation that creates sustainable solutions that people can depend on and that are easily accessible to everyone. From a team, acknowledge the differences on your team and embrace those differences and understand that they are not a bad thing. That's huge. And when we do that, all of a sudden, you mentioned assimilation, we now stop that piece and we really do create a culture of belonging where there's a high level of their uniqueness and there's a high appreciation of those individuals specifically, and that creates belonging. From an individual perspective, making sure that you just open yourself up to the differences and not be so closed off, despite how our subconscious manifests itself and unconsciously we show up because of the lens with which we view the world based off of our past experiences.
And, one thing I want to bring up is Denise asked here the quote. Can you repeat for us who that quote comes from, please?
Yep, absolutely. It was Liberty University, and I believe it was the senior VP of communications, if I'm not mistaken. And I can't recall his name right off the top of my head,
Okay.
but it was a quote from him. And if you Google Liberty University SVP of communications, you'll see it pop up. It's floating around all over there.
Okay. Thanks for that. So, this team level, I think, is really an untapped resource here for us. And this has been an area that I've really focused on in my work, empowering every manager to become what I characterize as a multiplier of well-being. So, let's dive a little bit more into this kind of, every manager as not only a multiplier of well-being, but also a multiplier of DEI meets wellness.
Yeah.
And what that might look like. One of the, and to get this started, I mean, one of the things that I really think about in creating, I love when you talk about this kind of within every team, create this culture of belonging, celebrating the diversity that is represented within the group. But a key piece to that is really the connection with psychological safety. And one of the key pieces of psychological safety is that there is representation of everybody's voices, that you don't have a team in which a few voices dominate and other voices are never heard. And that's certainly one thing that every manager can do, is that they can look out for that and make sure that there is some equity in shared airtime. What are some other thoughts that you have if every manager were to reposition themselves as a multiplier of DEI meets wellness? What does that look like?
First thing is education. Don't depend on those few individuals in your organization to educate you. You can go and ask questions, but take the time to educate yourself. There is nothing more taxing than people coming to you expecting you to be the voice for all Black people in America. And when you say something, they take that sound bite and they exercise it as that. So education, being an ally and understanding that allyship is not something that you turn off or turn on. It is not a noun, it is a verb, meaning it is something that you do all day, every day, speaking up for those voices that can't be heard. Understanding that and recognizing that privilege isn't a bad thing when it's spoken about, that we all have privilege. It just depends on the circumstances and the situation. So understanding, when you look around the room, what is your level of privilege that you have amongst that group, and how can you leverage that for the good of the entire group?
And Lana has written in here, DEI and belonging can be so beautifully infused with and by wellness. Thanks so much for that comment, Lana. And again, encourage people to share their thoughts, continue sharing their thoughts, and also posing questions here. But okay, here we have one from Elizabeth. If I am running a wellness program, and outside of that, the client is going to also start a DEI initiative, how would you advise that organization to demonstrate this intersection in terms of messaging and programming? Such a great question. Thank you, Elizabeth. What are your thoughts,
Yeah, so for me, I would say that identifying where those connections can be made. So like I mentioned, healthcare providers that are culturally competent, and saying, as part of our DEI initiative, we're focusing on the wellness of the individual, both mental and physical. So here are things that we've done with our DI program and how it connects over to this group, making sure that you are getting input from that respective group as well, and saying, hey, what would you like to see? Don't be afraid. Don't make decisions in a vacuum and a silo, and don't be afraid to reach out and ask them, what would you like to see? What would help you? If you could identify 3 things, what would those 3 things be? And start incorporating that into the program and embedding that into the different pieces of the organization in its entirety. That all of a sudden creates it and makes sure that it's in the fabric of the company versus just being very surface and performative.
Yeah, that's certainly something that I'm always trying to bring forward, is that wellness and now our conversation around DEI meets wellness can't just be programmatic. It needs to be really infused and embedded into the way the work gets done. I love also the way you're talking about the importance of cultural competency and really bringing that into the healthcare providers, and how that's brought in, and getting input from everybody across the organization. And Elizabeth is saying thank you. And thanks so much for the question, Elizabeth. I'm curious is about, one of the ways that I see the intersection between the two, and one of the ways that we can be thinking about this in terms of both messaging, but also programmatically, is around this idea of what I like to call wellness privilege. Do you have wellness privilege? And I'm curious, particularly because you were talking about, privilege is not necessarily a bad thing. We got to recognize this. But one of the things that I've really seen in the world of well-being is a lot of tips that are issued. Things like, get out into nature, but they assume privilege. So do you have access to decent green spaces? 100 million Americans don't. Or come to work as your full authentic self. That also assumes wellness privilege. Do you get to come to work as your full authentic self?
And
so,
Laura, typically it's only come to work.
It's
only come to work as your authentic self if you're like me.
Right.
So even that in and of itself, I love the fact that you termed this wellness privilege. I think that's just a phenomenal statement, and things that we don't think about. A way to elevate your privilege for the benefit of others is if you know that, think about how might this individual's experience be different than mine, and what you have access to, and diversify your circle and invite them out to invite those individuals that are different from you that you typically would not talk to out to be able to take advantage of some of your privilege. So like you mentioned, the green space, if you know that you're going out for a walk, and invite someone out for the weekend, invite someone up to have coffee with you or lunch with you on I'm sitting across from the Sears Tower, on the rooftop of Sears Tower. There's a green space up there. So although that we have it, if we don't see someone out there that looks like us, we probably won't go, because there's this level of comfort that's simply not there, nor is there that community, which I think is one of the pieces to your model, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. Bringing up that even though someone quote is invited, it may feel so uncomfortable that effectively you don't feel invited unless you are brought in. And that is certainly something that, if you do hold privilege, this is something that you can be thinking about doing, is reaching out to be able to invite others in.
Yeah.
And I would say also kind of invite on the other side, also inviting people into the conversation. We talked a little bit about this idea of kind of calling people in as opposed to just calling people out, so that we can really move this forward to make, to really bring more opportunity for everyone in the workplace. So I'd love to hear, what are your top 3 takeaways for our listeners in our conversation today?
Yeah. So one is acknowledging that differences aren't a bad thing. It's not bad to talk about them. It's not bad to address them in a respectful way. The second thing is ask the very basic question of, how might your experience be different than mine, and force yourself to answer that question. Because when you do that, I think you're going to identify where privilege may be showing up for you as an individual, and where you might be able to lend yourself, your expertise, to someone else, and you have no idea how that might impact them. And the third piece is, we can't become culturally competent unless we diversify our circle. So take a look at who's in your circle. Ask yourself basic questions. Who's on the left side of me? Who's on the right side of me? What's my doctor look like? What's my religious or spiritual leader look like? And identify those individuals, and then say, okay, who do I need to be in my circle? And just invite them in. So, because the more that we understand the different dimensions of diversity and those cultural pieces, we can really hone in and lean in on ways to help those individuals and truly create a culture of belonging in that situation.
So it's not bad to have these conversations, and we can begin with kind of asking, how do I show up? How do I connect with people? How might my experience be different from someone else's? And then to really diversify our circles, thinking about that in terms of our friends, our coworkers, our teams, our organizations, our communities. I'm always so shocked at just how separated and segregated we often are, and we can each start with looking at ways to diversify our circle. How can people follow your work? And I've really loved our conversation and how thoughtful it's been. And I can only imagine that the organizations that have the opportunity to be able to work with you really have someone that is able to bring this forward in such a compassionate way, in an inclusive and inviting way. But how can people follow your work, and how can people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, thank you. My website is israelgreene.com, and that's ISRAELGREENE. I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can search for me there as J Israel Greene. And then on Instagram, which is Israel _Greene there.
Excellent. And so I know that there were some questions about some comments about wellness privilege. Thanks so much for your thoughts around that as well. This is something that I'm so intrigued with, the intersection, not only wellness, but also the intersection and not only DEI, but how the two go hand in hand. AJ posted already that we do have a link that you can go to where you can access 50 ways that you might have wellness privilege in the workplace. Our next our next guest is going to be Jessica Grossmeyer, and we'll be diving into the topic of social connections. That will be happening at the same time, same place on July 26th. And in the meantime, thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for being our amazing guest. I can't wait to continue to follow your wonderful work, but really appreciate all the perspectives that you brought to our conversation today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, and see you next month.